we are welcoming Samuel N. Dorf. Samuel N. Dorf has recently been promoted to Professor of Music and currently serves as Associate Director of the Honors Program at the University of Dayton. A musicologist and dance historian, his monograph, Performing Antiquity, Ancient Greek Music and Dance from Paris to Delphi, 1890 to 1935, Oxford University Press, 2019, examines the performance and reinvention of ancient Greek musician and dance in fin-de-siecle Paris and queer music reception. So welcome, Sam.
Well, thanks. Can you guys see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I was kind of inspired based on the other papers that were on the session to sort of offer a little bit of something about dance. I thought that would be a little change of scene. Oh, you see my presenter view. Well, let me fix that. Okay. We'll do it this way then. So is that okay? All right. So yeah, I thought I'd talk a little bit about dance, and hopefully this builds on some of the discussions the other presenters shared with us today, and also perhaps this is also part of a work in progress I'm working on currently about dance and visual culture. So it's a work in progress. Okay, so before the American expatriate Natalie Clifford Barney's play Equivoque graced the Parisian stage of the Théâtre du Louvre in 1909, it premiered in her suburban Parisian backyard. Sometime around 1905 or 1906, the playwright, who had written a drama based on the life and myths of Sappho of Lesbos, assembled a group of formidable and predominantly lesbian and bisexual women at her home in Neuilly, and directed them to perform this queer love story in broad daylight. The famed French writer Colette, the actress, dancer, and socialite Eva Palmer, and Penelope Duncan, sister-in-law of the dancer Isadora Duncan, were among those who danced barefoot or in ancient styled Greek sandals. They wore billowing white floor-length Greek robes and moved to imagined ancient music composed of traditional Greek songs and improvisations on the flute and small harps. The story they presented centered on the love between the ancient Greek lyric poet Sappho and her fictionalized bride-to-be, who ultimately abandons Sappho and marries a man. Photographs of this performance show an ensemble scene, as you can see here, where the women dance with hands raised, circling a platform, holding Penelope Duncan, who is playing the harp. There she is. Palmer orating, you can see in the middle, or singing from the center. We don't know if she's orating or singing, and an unidentified flute player. The courtesan and dancer Leon de Pougy appears on the far left here, looking at the camera, while Barney stands in the center in white and in half profile. So while American women like Natalie Clifford Barney, Isadora Duncan, and Eva Palmer, later known as Eva Palmer Seclianos, landed in Paris in the early 1900s, several of them possessed a renewed interest in ancient Greek dance that birthed and nurtured a new and modern form of dance. The choreographed movements of Barney, Duncan, and Palmer circulated through photography, the press, and other forms of publication and distribution. It would be notable enough that these artists shaped and influenced modern dance practices in the 20th century, but they also played a critical role in shaping the reception of innovative dance in their lifetimes. They recorded and distributed their movements and gestures in ways that reimagined ancient Greek dance, and they made concerted efforts to communicate their performances to new audiences. Barney, Duncan, and Palmer each found their movement vocabularies from a variety of inspirations, but common to all was a fascination with the dance of Greek antiquity. Common to all of them was also an interest of embodying a different type of antiquity, less Sophocles and more Sappho. But why Greek antiquity? What drew these women to the classical past? And how did that past shape modern dance? A key element of ancient dance, as observed by both of all these women and their contemporary archaeological peers, was its relative freedom in comparison with the more familiar types of dance seen on the stages from Paris to Pittsburgh. Concert dance privileged the movements and costuming of the ballet. That is, constrictive footwear, constrictive bodices that help dancers execute specialized movements, often on point, with formalized and similarly restricted body alignment. On the page of the Opéra in Paris in 1900, one would have seen the majority of dancers employing stylistic elements of the danse d'école, the academic classical ballet techniques and traditions exemplified by works such as Giselle and Swan Lake. Offstage, Belle Epoque women in both the United States and France were expected to wear similarly constraining contemporary dress. Tightly corseted bodices, tightly laced boots, and billowing skirts limited women's movements as they went about their daily lives. Ancient Greek-inspired costuming was less constricting. Less constricting. Uncorseted flowing gowns, which you can see Barney wearing here on the right, and barefoot or sandaled feet allowed dancers and non-dancers to move more freely and more naturally. These gestures and fashions were embraced by a new generation of women, making their voices heard and their bodies seen in Paris. Barney, a central figure in this network of women, hosted a literary and artistic salon at her house in Paris for over half a century. Events took place in Barney's salon or in her backyard pavilion, which housed a small stage and her own ancient Greek temple of friendship. And this temple served as a site for her neo-Sapphic rites, including plays, dance, and music. It was not just a place to perform the past, but more importantly, it was a space to meet, to connect, to be, to imagine a future. Barney's salon was unique due to the way she weaved her interest in Greek antiquity, lesbian erotics, and performance. She first held gatherings to bring together actors, dancers, musicians, writers, artists, and intellectuals in the 1890s at a rented home in the Parisian suburb of Neuilly, where her queer play Equivoque premiered. And after that scandalous performance, she was forced to move to a new rental home in Paris's Left Bank, where she lived and held a literary salon every Friday afternoon until 1968. Born into a wealthy family in Dayton, Ohio, where I am speaking to you now, Barney attended boarding school in France and summered in Bar Harbor, Maine. In the late 1880s, when she was just 12 years old, she realized she was a lesbian. And she writes about this in her unpublished childhood memoirs. She came out to a boy her age who was also vacationing in Maine, a boy she suspected may also have been gay, and it was he who introduced her to the poetry of Sappho. And this was a total revelation to Barney. These poems of Sappho, thousands of years old, were not only beautiful and elegant to Barney and her peers, but also enticing, for they seemed to describe a world of lust, sex, and connections between women, a world that was absent in much of the literature Barney had previously known. Learning Sappho was like discovering herself, she wrote. To read the eroticism of these poems for Barney was to read her own desires, and she quickly sought out to learn ancient Greek, and to help her, she befriended another young socialite vacationing in Maine, Eva Palmer. An aspiring actress, Palmer was discovering her own bisexuality through the poetry of Sappho. And moving to Paris and then to Greece, Palmer then married the Greek poet and playwright and Nobel laureate Angelos Siklianos. When Palmer and Barney were young women, though, they worked together to trace a female lineage, a queer history of antiquity that resonated with their modern hopes and dreams for a brighter queer future. Sappho was their guide. Since she had been dead for millennia, they could only commune with her through the fractured remains of her lyrical work, an act of recovery that's not so different from the present way dancers and musicians commune with objects of historical study, as we've seen earlier. Like the static images of ancient dance, the poetic fragments are so tantalizing that they demand to be performed again. Their gaps need to be filled in. And as we all know, for centuries, scholars, poets, musicians, and dancers and actors have filled in those gaps, reimagining Sappho's life and loves over and over. In addition to their Parisian performances, Barney and Palmer participated in theatricals written by Barney's mother and dreamed of reciting Sappho's poetry with harp accompaniments at their father's country club in Maine. When Barney settled permanently in Paris, she sought out other like-minded women, upper-class lesbian and bisexual women, many of whom were also American emigres, Together, they built this community of queer women fascinated by the life of ancient lesbians. This group was a veritable who's who of artistic Paris. And at the center was Natalie Barney, of course, but nearby was Eva Palmer. And they soon found the poet Pauline Tarn, known by her pen name Renée Vivienne, as well as the famed dancer and courtesan Liane de Pougy. As lesbian bisexual women in 1900, they were seeking their ancestors in ancient Greek language, costume, and gesture, provided a gateway. And in lieu of a family tree of queer mothers and fathers, they sought historical sources to commune with them. They performed them, and they recruited other women to perform them as well, reenacting ancient Greek poetry, music, dance, and drama. And Barney did not just recreate Greek culture in print, she performed it with her friends in Paris in ways that blended scholarship on ancient Greece, dance, music, poetry, and lesbian erotics. And while ostensibly a private performance, the photographs from Equivoque, the play I mentioned at the beginning, were reported on and shared in the press, both in France and back in the United States, where Barney's hometown newspaper, my own hometown newspaper, the Dayton Journal, covered the scandal of the performance, reproducing select photographs from the event and sharing all the gossip about why this young woman had to move. There were private performances along with public and semi-private ones, of course. And participants were not only interested in reenacting antiquity in ways that appealed to their visions of the future, but also committed to documenting and preserving a record of their work. The archives of the Smithsonian Institution houses boxes of Natalie Barney's personal photographs, which you've seen a few of, that capture theatricals and dances, as well as snapshots of a life, including this newspaper. Stage portraits, vacation pictures, and souvenir photos all commingle in acid-free archival storage boxes, waiting for a new generation of scholars and dreamers to spend time getting to know these women, to examine their images and reimagine the gestures that they performed. Frederick Nehrbaut has argued that this vogue for recreating and reimagining ancient dances at this time stems in part from the pioneering scholarly work of the French musicologist and composer Maurice Emmanuel, along with a few other things like the advances in technology to capture movement, a renewed interest in authentic performative reconstruction, as well as the ability for the quote-unquote classical tradition to provide license for artists to depict erotic scenes under the auspices of fidelity to famous established classical sources. Years before Václav Nijinsky became a faun with the Ballet Russe, and Isidore Duncan danced Tanagra figurines in Parisian ateliers, Emmanuel developed a methodology for recovering the dances of ancient Greeks using the same museum artifacts favored by the dancers of early modernism. In his well-circulated 1896 treatise, the Danse grecque antique, Emmanuel argued that the dances of the ancient Greeks could be reconstructed based on the static poses preserved on pottery and in statuary standing in museums across Europe. Emmanuel sought to recreate the ancient Greek dance by studying the surviving images from vases and bas-relief, and then he took fast motion photography, which you can see here, of modern ballet technique, and compared the static images from the ancient cups and vases and the photographic frames separated by millennia to reconstruct the poses from the distant past in the bodies of living dancers. For example, Emmanuel would examine a female figure from an ancient Greek vase on her toes, head flung back, hair and loosely draped garment rippling with movement, raising her left knee and extending her arms as representing a dancer executing a pirouette sur le cul de pied en demi-point. He came to this conclusion by comparing this image to photographs of modern dancers executing the exact same balletic turns. Other ancient images of women holding hands indicated a women's circle dance to follow a god, according to Emmanuel's analysis. However, while Emmanuel used the authority of classical dance to bolster his quite conservative preference for the ballet over that of modern dance, the images he lauded from antiquity also showed similarities to images of innovative contemporary dancers such as Josephine Baker, even though he routinely denigrated the dance of Black Americans in his later studies. And so, with over 600 illustrations of ancient dance, Emmanuel's treatise became a widely popular source of inspiration for early 20th century dancers and choreographers interested in antiquity. regardless of whether they're interested in furthering Emmanuel's traditional views on dance. Now, while she never mentioned reading the book in her own letters or memoirs, the American dancer Isadora Duncan almost certainly studied La Danse Grecque Antique in one of the French editions or in an English translation. Born in San Francisco, Isadora spent her early years enveloped in a family enthralled with art and dance. Upon the death of her father, her mother took her and her brother Raymond Duncan to London and then to Paris, where she arrived in Paris in 1900. Isadora was not the only dancer who took inspiration from Greek antiquity, yet her vision of antiquity differed markedly from her French colleagues. In a letter from 1900, she explained that the Greek dance that she witnessed at the Opera by her French ballet colleagues was, quote, a sort of modified ballet in white gowns, that she characterized it as, quote, all stupid vanity and vexation, not the slightest glimmering knowledge of Apollo or the Graces, or even of the kindly Pan. What Duncan envisioned for ancient Greek dance was something modern, free, lyrical, yet powerful, that is uncorseted, barefoot or in sandals, in loosely draped gowns, often outdoors, as you can see here, and free from the danse-d'école expectations of narrow waists and sylph-like waifs on point. Duncan's cocktail of gestures and influences resonated with the emerging generation of artists excited by the modernist movement across the arts, freedom from the formal rules of schools, be they of painting, sculpture, poetry, literature, music composition, or dance, radical experimentation of forms and styles, and abstraction. Edward Steichen's photographs of Duncan dancing in Greeks captured this new image of woman along the ruins of antiquity. This one from 1921 shows Duncan dwarfed by the columns of the Parthenon in Athens. The dancer and all the modern things she represents are positioned at the literal foot of the classical ancient Greek tradition she so valued. Though rendered small in scale by the mighty columns, Duncan stands firm, suggesting the strength, the permanence of her body. Compare this to the following image, where her body seems to fly through the air, pulled at the hips, letting her head and arms and feet fall back in their wake. The photographs capture two aspects of Duncan's dance, its monumentality and its connections to traditions valued by high art, but they also emphasize her curves and the naturalness of the female body. Duncan's dancing body broke free from the expectations of classical ballet. She could be a statue, a pillar, a monument of feminine American energy, standing tall and noble in a foreign land, or with her bent backwards, her sweeping arms could let go of the rigidity of the danse-d'école. Her wrists could be relaxed and her arms could be extended, and she could still convey the force of gravity, pulling them back down. Instead of the airiness in classical ballet illustrated through point work, Duncan's body could receive its lightness through dramatic contortions of her torso, a lifting of the hips and pelvis, and a toss of the head. As an ephemeral and embodied art form that is notoriously defied fixing or setting, dance is ever-changing, never stable, and seemingly impossible to capture. Before the advent of filmic preservation, a dancer's movements were passed from body to body, from teacher to student, with the recognition that the body teaching the movements and gestures was different than the body's learning those steps. One can translate dances into narrative descriptions, as Duncan often did. Most commonly, dance was fixed, though, or set through portraiture via a variety of media, such as photography, as we've seen here, drawing, sculpture, and painting. The thousands, and yes, I'm serious, thousands of drawings and watercolors of Duncan created by Abraham Volkovitz offer another way for me, right, as a dance scholar, to understand her contributions to the field. Volkovitz, who first met Duncan in Paris in 1906, was known to have taken many of his illustrations of Duncan to the streets of Times Square in New York, which he sold for a nickel each. In her book on Volkovitz's drawings of Duncan, dance scholar Ann Cooper Albright notes how the artist pushed Duncan to the very edges of the pieces of paper he illustrated. As a, quote, reflection of Duncan's powerful performance presence, reflective of her ability to fill up even the largest stages, Reverberating into the space outside the frame, her body spills over the traditional boundaries of artistic practice to create a kinesthetic dialogue with the viewer. This series of 5 line drawings of Duncan illustrate Volkowitz's technique. Within the swirls of fabric and rush of movement, the dancer's form emerges in snippets, a thigh, knee, and leg in one, a face in another, a heel and ankle, armpits and calves. The frame seen in succession, like the photographs from Maurice Emmanuel's book or a film, not only imply movement, but force viewers like you and me to imagine movement, maybe even feel movement, or even incite us or invite us to move our own bodies. We might feel invited not by the knowing hand of a teacher or the artist, but rather the static image itself. Duncan's body seems ready to break free from the boundaries of the drawing, ready to dance for, or maybe almost even with us. These images mainly inform us or allow us to inform ourselves about what this movement may have felt and looked like. For scholars interested in the ancient Greek-inspired early modernist dance of Duncan, these documents are invaluable in helping us commune with the dance, similar to how Emmanuel himself may have communed with the images of ancient dancers. Isadora Duncan's dance has often been compared to the work of American modern dancer Loie Fuller. Known for her dances with elaborate electric lights and costumes comprising yards and yards of fabric, she manipulated her gowns to swirl around her and resemble flowers, butterflies, and more. The 30-year-old American dancer took Paris by storm in the last decade of the 19th century. Critics often compared the two women, Duncan and Fuller. But the senior Fuller was careful to distance her own performance from those of Duncan and her students, whom she felt were too fixated on copying ancient Greek art. Fuller's vision of ancient Greek naturalists came less from the animation of static images than from her own natural instincts, she writes, which provided access to a kind of collective memory of dance history, which led back to ancient Greece, in her words. We too can access the dances of the past through a variety of methods, as evidenced by the work of the women examined in this talk. Studying static images and imagining and then experimentally embodying these dances in the living body of dancers and scholars today has been a familiar technique for shedding light on dance's history, and as we've seen also for music's history. Like many other dance historians, I engage with Fuller, Duncan, Palmer, and Barney through their images. I learned their dances not from taking classes or having a knowledgeable hand guide my body to move like them. Rather, I've come to understand these women's dances through visual representations that have captured, framed, and fixed the ways their bodies moved. The process of understanding these women's early ancient Greek-inspired dance is not so dissimilar from the ways dancers and artists of their own generation sought to understand ancient Greek dance. Ann Cooper Albright's study of the work of Loie Fuller not only delves deep into archives, but the dance historian uses her own kinesthetic imagination to embody images of Loie Fuller, sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively. That is, Albright puts on the billowing yards of fabric herself, and she danced in those costumes to try to understand something of Fuller's experience from the inside out. In 1900, the Sillon de Comieux foundry in Paris mass-produced a lamp pedestal of Loie Fuller. This golden-hued bronze sculpture depicts the famed dancer executing one of her signature steps, engulfed in billowing folds of fabric swirling over her head and around her body. In classic Art Nouveau fashion, this is not just a sculpture, but it's a lamp. And this lamp is both a work of art and a utilitarian item for the home. The performer who played with light becomes the source of light herself, casting a warm glow. Now, just as an example, I've seen this statue many times because we have one at the Dayton Art Institute in Dayton, Ohio, where I live. It stands on a pedestal in the middle of a room of Art Nouveau paintings and home decor. Isolated on its island, the bronze glints in the overhead lighting, but the wiring and light bulbs needed for internal illumination are missing. As an art object, a statue of a dancer I've studied It has given me an opportunity to creatively imagine the ways Fuller may have danced, or at least the way an artist who depicted her imagined she danced. Sometimes that's as close as I can get to historical dance. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. Well, I think we are now ready to welcome our panelists. See if they're all here. I see